I never had the luxury of a safety net. Some people are born into wealth, privilege, or at least a family that can cushion their fall. I was born into reality. My mom, a woman who carried the weight of the world on her back, worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. She was a waitress by day, a cleaning lady by night, and a superhero in between. We lived in a cramped apartment where the walls were thin, the neighbors were loud, and the idea of vacation meant walking an extra few blocks to a slightly nicer park. But one thing my mother drilled into me, harder than the heels of her worn-out work shoes, was this: you will build a better life than I ever could. So I did. I studied like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. Late nights, early mornings, extra shifts, and skipped meals all blended into one long, exhausting blur. When other kids were partying, I was working. When they slept, I studied. And when they laughed about their parents cutting them off from their trust funds, I was counting loose change for bus fare. But I made it. Full-ride scholarship, business degree, corporate job. I still remember the first day I walked into that high-rise, my cheap blazer a little too stiff, my heels a little too loud on the polished floors. I was an outsider in a world of legacies and nepotism, but I didn't care. I worked harder, stayed later, and climbed faster than anyone expected. And just like that, I became the youngest department head in the company's history. But success, I'd soon learn, is a lonely climb, and just when I thought I was finally safe, finally seen, I met him. Adrian Lancaster, the man who would teach me that not all mountains are worth climbing. I wasn't looking for love. I barely had time for sleep, let alone dating. My life was spreadsheets, meetings, and caffeine. Lots of caffeine. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. It happened at a corporate dinner, one of those overpriced, candlelit affairs where everyone pretends they actually like their coworkers. I was halfway through a glass of wine, nodding at a conversation I had no interest in when he walked in. Adrian Lancaster, the kind of man who turned heads without even trying. Tall, confident, expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The room shifted when he entered, like he carried his own gravitational pull. And somehow, by the end of the night, that pull had drawn me in. We talked. First about work, then about books, travel, stupid childhood stories. He listened, like really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. And when he laughed, it wasn't polite or forced. It was real. I should have been skeptical. Men like him didn't end up with women like me. His world was champagne towers and private clubs. Mine was thrift store blazers and counting pennies before payday. But when he asked for my number, I gave it to him. And just like that, my life started to change. One date turned into 2. 2 turned into a weekend getaway. Before I knew it, I was waking up in his penthouse, drinking coffee that cost more per cup than my entire breakfast budget in college. He made me feel like I belonged, like our differences didn't matter. And then one night, under a sky littered with city lights, he pulled out a velvet box. "Marry me," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked onto mine. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wasn't a girl who believed in fairy tales, but in that moment, with his hands around mine, I let myself believe in this one. So I said yes. I had no idea what I was saying yes to. I should have known. The moment the Lancaster estate came into view, I should have turned around and left. The wrought iron gates alone looked like they were designed to keep people like me out. The driveway stretched so long it felt like a road of judgment leading to a house, no, a mansion, that looked ripped straight from a history book. I had spent the entire morning psyching myself up. Be polite, be charming, smile, don't let them see you sweat. But the second I stepped inside, the air turned 10 degrees colder. "Naomi, welcome," Mrs. Lancaster said, her lips forming something that resembled a smile but lacked anything close to warmth. She was stunning in that way only old money could be. Elegant, effortlessly put together, not a hair out of place. The kind of woman who smelled like Chanel and generational wealth. Mr. Lancaster, standing beside her, didn't bother with the fake pleasantries. He barely looked at me. "So you're the one Adrian's been talking about." His voice was even, but something about the way he said it made it clear he wasn't impressed. I had barely opened my mouth before they started their subtle assassination of my entire existence. "Where did you say you studied again?" Mrs. Lancaster asked, as if she hadn't already researched my entire life. University of Michigan, I said with a polite smile. Oh, she said, glancing at her husband. State school. How? Admirable. Admirable. Like I had clawed my way out of the sewer and somehow managed to learn how to read. Mr. Lancaster finally looked at me then, studying me like a businessman sizing up a bad investment. Your family, what do they do? Translation, are you important enough to be in our world? I lifted my chin. My mother worked 2 jobs to raise me on her own. A pause. Then, how? Inspiring, admirable, polite words that felt like slaps. Dinner was even worse. The table was the size of a runway, each place setting more elaborate than my entire kitchen back home. The conversation was carefully curated, discussing people I didn't know, places I'd never been, experiences I couldn't afford. Every now and then, Mrs. Lancaster would ask me a question, and no matter how I answered, she found a way to make me feel small. Do you travel often, Naomi? I've been to a few places, I said, thinking of budget trips with my mom, road trips with friends. Oh, lovely, she said, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. Adrian just loves Europe. Of course, he grew up spending summers in the south of France. It's so important to be cultured, don't you think? Translation, you're not enough. I stole a glance at Adrian, hoping for some kind of lifeline. But he just sat there, sipping his wine, offering me nothing but an occasional reassuring smile. I wanted to believe I could win them over, that if they saw how much I loved their son, they'd accept me. I didn't realize back then, they never planned to. I never thought I'd have to take lessons just to be accepted as someone's fiancé. Yet there I was, sitting in a pristine white room with floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by porcelain tea sets and stiff-backed chairs, while a woman named Margaret eyed me like I was an unsolved problem. Margaret was the kind of woman who had never worked a day in her life unless you counted curating charity galas as work. She had perfect posture, pearls that probably cost as much as my car, and a tone that made every sentence sound like a well-mannered insult. We have much to refine, she said with a sigh, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on a notebook labeled Poise, Speech, and Elegance. Translation, you're a mess, and I'm here to fix you. Lesson number 1, how to sit like a proper woman. Apparently, the way I had been sitting my entire life was incorrect. Legs must cross at the ankles, hands folded delicately, chin tilted at just the right angle. Not too high, arrogant, not too low, weak. I lasted 5 minutes before my leg cramped. Margaret didn't blink. You'll adjust. If you wish to be part of high society, grace must be effortless. I wanted to tell her that my idea of grace was not spilling coffee on my blouse during morning meetings. Lesson number 2, how to speak without sounding common. Avoid direct statements, dear, Margaret instructed. A refined woman suggests rather than declares. So instead of saying, I don't like oysters, I say, one might find oysters an acquired taste. I blinked, but I don't like oysters. Margaret's lips twitched. Try it again. I exhaled through my nose. One might find oysters disgusting. Margaret closed her eyes like she was asking the universe for patience. Lesson number 3, walking with elegance. This was the final humiliation, a book on my head, heels I could barely balance in, a mirror reflecting back a woman I was struggling to recognize. I stumbled once, then again. Margaret sighed. This will take time. I wanted to scream. Instead, I bit my tongue, because this was for Adrian, right? That's what I kept telling myself. That's what I whispered every time I let another part of myself get chipped away. One night, after another exhausting session, Adrian called. How are the lessons? He asked. I hesitated. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I felt like I was drowning, that his mother had handed me a script and expected me to become a different person to fit the role. But instead I laughed. Oh, you know? Learning how to sit without offending anyone, he chuckled. You're doing great, babe. My parents just need time to see how amazing you are. I closed my eyes. Then why don't they just look? That was the first time I wondered if I was making a mistake. And once the doubt crept in, it refused to leave. Weddings are supposed to be about love, about promises, about 2 people choosing each other, flaws and all. Mine was about power, and I didn't realize it until it was too late. The Lancaster estate looked like something out of a royal fairy tale that morning. White roses spilling over golden arches, chandeliers glittering inside the grand ballroom, the air thick with the scent of wealth. I should have been in my bridal suite, sipping champagne, surrounded by love. Instead, I was standing in the staff kitchen, my wedding dress still zipped in its garment bag, while a woman in an apron shoved a clipboard into my hands. "Mrs. Lancaster said you'd be handling the catering schedule," she said briskly. "The servers need direction before guests arrive." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "She said you're in charge of making sure everything runs smoothly." The words didn't compute. I was the bride. The bride. I turned, searching for anyone who could make sense of this, and then I saw her. Mrs. Lancaster, standing in the doorway, calm as ever, sipping tea like she hadn't just hijacked my wedding day. "Naomi, dear," she said smoothly, "we need to ensure everything is perfect. You're the only one I trust to manage it." Trust. That wasn't trust. That was control. "I'm supposed to be getting ready," I said, my voice uneven. Her smile was thin. "Yes, and once everything is handled, you may." Like I was an employee, a guest in my own wedding, my hands clenched around the clipboard. "This is my day, and it will be perfect, so long as you do your part." My part. As if I hadn't spent months contorting myself to fit into this family, as if I hadn't swallowed every insult, every quiet humiliation, just to stand here today. A cold, sick realization crawled up my spine. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. I didn't belong. I never had. I stormed out, my heart hammering against my ribs, straight to the one person who was supposed to be on my side, Adrian. I found him in the lounge, adjusting his cufflinks, looking like a goddamn magazine cover. Cool. Collected. Oblivious. "Did you know about this?" I demanded, shoving the clipboard into his chest. He caught it with a frown. "What are you talking about? Your mother just put me in charge of the catering staff." His frown deepened. "And?" I stared at him. "And? I'm the bride, Adrian." "Not a party planner." He exhaled, like I was being dramatic. "Naomi, my mother is just making sure things run smoothly. This isn't a big deal." "It is to me." He set the clipboard aside. "Why are you making this about you?" I actually laughed, a dry, hollow sound that didn't belong in a fairy tale. "Because it is about me," I shot back. "And the fact that you don't see that is the problem." He ran a hand through his hair like he was losing patience. "Naomi, my family, this world, it's different. You need to prove yourself before you demand respect." The words slammed into me like a slap. Prove myself? My voice barely made it past my lips. "I'm about to marry you, and you still think I have to earn my place?" He sighed. "That's not what I meant." But it was. It was exactly what he meant. I had spent an entire year fighting to be worthy of this family, and now, on the day that should have been mine, I finally saw the truth. Adrian Lancaster had never truly chosen me. He had chosen a version of me that didn't exist, and I wasn't willing to play the part anymore. I turned on my heel, walking away before I could change my mind. "Naomi, where are you going?" I didn't stop. "Home." "You're overreacting." I spun back. "No, I'm finally reacting, and it feels really damn good." And with that, I ripped off the invisible chains I had let this family put on me, because I deserved more, and I'd find it without them. I was already halfway to the doors when I heard my mother's voice. "Naomi, wait." I turned, heart hammering, and there she was, my mother, my rock, standing in the grand Lancaster estate like she had every right to be there. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a man I didn't recognize, older, sharply dressed, with a knowing smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked amused. And Mrs. Lancaster? For the first time since I met her, she looked afraid. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence as my mother stepped forward. "I wasn't going to say anything," she started, her voice steady. "I told myself it wasn't my fight, but after the way they treated you?" She turned to look directly at Mr. and Mrs. Lancaster. "I think it's time Naomi knows exactly who she almost married." A slow tension coiled in my stomach. "Mom, what's going on?" She inhaled deeply, then looked at the stranger beside her. "This is Daniel Grayson. He's an investigative journalist, and he's been digging into the Lancasters for a while now." Adrian scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Mrs. Lancaster didn't move. Mr. Lancaster's jaw tensed. Grayson took his cue and stepped forward, slipping a folder from the sleek briefcase at his side. "Let's talk about the great Lancaster family, shall we?" He flipped open the file, revealing photographs, old documents, newspaper clippings. For decades, the Lancasters have presented themselves as an old money dynasty. Aristocratic roots, generational wealth, high society connections. He smirked, tilting his head. All of it is a lie. That's absurd, Adrian snapped, stepping forward. Our family has been— Your family, Grayson interrupted, flipping another page, was middle class until about 40 years ago. Your grandfather, Henry Lancaster, changed the family name, bought his way into exclusive circles, started fabricating a legacy, one donation and shady business deal at a time. I stared at Adrian, waiting for him to deny it. He didn't. Mrs. Lancaster's hands tightened around the silk folds of her dress. Grayson went on. Your parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lancaster, doubled down on the illusion. They rebranded, married into the right circles, bought properties that looked old money but were actually funded by risky investments. They built an empire of smoke and mirrors. Stop, Mrs. Lancaster finally said, her voice sharp. This is nothing but slander. Grayson merely smirked. Funny thing about slander doesn't hold up well when you have receipts. He held up one of the documents. You didn't inherit wealth, you created a mirage, and you used it to look down on people like Naomi when, in reality, she's more honest than you'll ever be. Silence, heavy, crushing. I turned to Adrian. Tell me this isn't true. He ran a hand through his hair, looking away. It's complicated. No, Adrian, it's simple. Either you lied or you didn't. His silence was my answer. My stomach twisted, a strange mix of rage and liberation. They had made me feel like an outsider, like I wasn't worthy. But the truth? They were just better liars. My mother turned to me, voice soft but firm. You don't need to marry into a family like this, Naomi. You deserve better. For the first time since I walked into this estate, I smiled. I know. And with that, I turned my back on Adrian Lancaster, his mother, his father, and their hollow little empire. Because I wasn't the one who needed to prove myself. They were, and they failed. The silence was deafening. For the first time, the Lancasters, the untouchable, elite, aristocratic family, looked small. I let the weight of it sink in, let it press against my skin, let it settle in my bones. And then, standing in the middle of their gilded cage, I made my choice. I exhaled, slow and steady. This wedding is over. Gasps rippled through the grand hall. A chandelier above cast sharp reflections over stunned faces. Guests, society elites, people who had come to witness my submission, not my rebellion. Mrs. Lancaster stiffened, her gloved hands curling at her sides. Naomi, don't be rash. These accusations mean nothing. We are Lancasters, and this wedding will continue as planned. I laughed. Not a bitter laugh. A free one. You still don't get it, Leah, do you? I said, shaking my head. It's not about your lies. It's about the fact that I don't need this. I don't need your approval. I don't need your world. And I sure as hell don't need a man who thinks I should be grateful to be here. I turned to Adrian, who had been too quiet, too still. But his eyes burned, not with regret, but with rage. You're making a mistake, he hissed. I lifted my chin. No, Adrian, I finally stopped making them. He took a step forward, voice dropping low. You think you're walking away? You think anyone in this room is going to take you seriously after this? I smirked. I think they'll take me more seriously than they'll take the family who built their name on a lie. A murmur spread through the crowd. The whispers were growing. The illusion was cracking. And Adrian knew it. His hand clenched at his side, his perfect composure slipping. You don't belong anywhere without me, Naomi. You're nothing. That was it. The final confirmation. This was never about love. It was about control. I let out a breath, and suddenly the weight of it all was gone. Watch me. I turned and walked. Not in a hurry, not running. Just walking, with dignity, with power, with the kind of freedom money could never buy. I didn't look back. Not when Adrian's voice cracked with desperation. Not when Mrs. Lancaster tried to smooth over the disaster unraveling around her. Not when the whispers turned into judgment, into scandal, into the end of their perfect dynasty. I walked toward the doors, toward the open air, toward the life that was still mine to build. And as I stepped into the sunlight, I smiled, because for the first time in my life, I chose me. It's funny how life has a way of correcting itself. Months ago, I stood in a mansion that wasn't mine, wearing a dress meant for someone I no longer recognized, trying to fit into a world that was never meant for me. Now, I wake up every morning in a home I built for myself. No chandeliers, no cold marble floors, no whispered judgments over breakfast, just warm sunlight, the scent of fresh coffee, and a life that feels like my own. I got promoted, not because of a name, not because of connections, but because I worked my ass off. I walked into my office one morning, the same one I had fought tooth and nail to earn, and my boss slid an envelope across my desk. Vice President of Operations. He said with a smile, "It's yours if you want it." I stared at the title, at the proof that I had always been enough, and for the first time in my life, I didn't hesitate. I want it. And then there was him. Not Adrian. Not even close. He wasn't a billionaire, wasn't the heir to some fabricated dynasty. He was kind, steady, real. He didn't care what fork I used at dinner. He didn't ask me to change the way I laughed, the way I spoke, the way I existed. He just saw me. One night, we sat on my tiny balcony, legs tangled, the city lights stretching far beyond us. "You ever regret it?" he asked, watching the skyline. I knew what he meant. I leaned back, letting the cool air settle around me. Not for a second. As for the Lancasters, they fell. Hard. The scandal was everywhere. The invitations stopped coming, the business deals evaporated, and the society pages, once filled with their names, now featured headlines about their fall from grace. Adrian tried to reach out once, a half-hearted apology, a let's talk message I never bothered to answer, because there was nothing left to say. I look around at my life now, at the home that feels like a home, at the job that fulfills me, at the love that doesn't ask me to be anything but myself, and I smile. This is the life I was always meant to live.